Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through Scripture for February the 12th. Our readings for today come out of Exodus chapter 34, the first 9 verses out of Exodus 35, Matthew 27, 15 through 31, Psalm 33, 23 through 22, and Proverbs 9, 1 through 6. And there's a lot of irony in today's readings. In particular, when you read Psalm 33 and you look at the verses that we're supposed to read starting in verse 12, this sentence really struck me today, especially when we started reading in Exodus and in Matthew. Verse 12 of Psalm 33 says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance." He's talking about the people of Israel, David is, when he writes this psalm. And it's really ironic because when you look at Psalm 34, this is 33, 34, all these Exodus, in the 30s of Exodus, you're looking at God establishing the law. And Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. You see, what the law did, according to Paul, was the law showed us our sin. It revealed sin because as soon as we saw the law, what did we do? We wanted to rebel. We wanted to turn away from it. The law was supposed to bring us closer. When you read about in Psalm 34, when you read Moses and the veil, the radiant face of Moses, we're supposed to be drawn closer to God when we follow his law. And yet we don't, do we? We turn farther away because our sinful nature doesn't like being placed underneath the authority of God unless we ourselves are that God. And so the people of Israel are supposed to be the chosen ones by God. And yet, Matthew chapter 27, verse 20, "But the chief priests and the elders," that is, the chief priests and the elders of the people of Israel, God's chosen people, "persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed." "Which of the two of you do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall then I do with Jesus, who's called the Messiah?" "This is Messiah. Isn't this the guy that you've been looking for a while?" And they answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" But they all shouted louder. They all shouted louder, "Crucify him!" When Pilate saw he's getting nowhere, that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands. Ceremonial washing here, folks. We just read all this in Exodus. In front of the crowd, "I am innocent of this man's blood." Of course, we know that he wasn't. "It's your responsibility." And all the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." And then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So then they mocked him. They beat him. They were cruel to him. Crowns of thorns being placed on his head deep to hurt. Put a staff and mocked him, saying, "Hail, hail, King of the Jews!" And they tore off his robe. They bargained off his clothes. And verse 31 says, "Then they led him away to crucify him." Do you see the irony? Psalm 33, verse 22. "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance." Everything that God did for the people of Israel, and yet when it came time for the Messiah to come, his own nation, his own people, crucified him. They mocked him. They beat him. They insulted him. His innocence didn't matter. Instead, they turned away. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle who God really was. You see, when we're faced with God, sometimes we just can't help but look. The people of Israel responded the same way with Moses. Whenever Moses came down from God, his face was radiant in Exodus. In Exodus 34, verse 30. His face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. And so Moses had to cover his face. Anytime he came after having experience with God, he had to cover his face because they couldn't handle the glory of God. The people of Israel couldn't handle God. They couldn't handle the truth that Jesus brought to the reality that they thought they knew. And God said, "No, here's what reality actually looks like." So instead of being the people chosen by God, they became the people that crucified God. Okay, there's our conversation for today. It was a heavy one. We'll see you next time.